friends, it's the Stitches, and today I'm going to give you a brief history of Lolita fashion. If you follow my channel for other reasons and you don't know what Lolita fashion is, it's basically a fashion subculture in Japan. My chair is sinking. It has a lot of influence from Rococo fashion and Victorian fashion, as well as like the 50s bell skirt silhouette type thing. Back in the day, we used to say, think Alice in Wonderland and French Maid Had a Baby, but nowadays it's a little less okay to describe it that way. So let's talk about the history. It's such a wild and extreme style that it had to have come from somewhere, right? So to understand how fashion evolved into this, we have to take it all the way back to the 60s and 70s. So in that time, there was what was called the Romantic fashion movement in the Western, especially the United States. Like the US was really big on this. You know, a lot of flowy things that you might wear to walk through a field of wildflowers holding a picnic basket in a little house on the prairie style storytelling, that sort of thing. The Romantic fashion movement was really interested in not only the elegance, but the attention to detail of the Victorian era. The Romantic fashion movement heavily inspired Japan, especially young Japanese women. The brand Milk established itself in 1970 in Japan and started selling all manner of romantic influenced garments. In 1979, we also get Angelic Pretty, although at the time it was still called Pretty. I don't know exactly when they went from being called Pretty to being called Angelic Pretty, but I assume it was around the time they made the switch to putting out strictly Lolita garments. But at this time, Lolita wasn't a thing yet, so they weren't actually selling Lolita pieces yet. Something has to become a trend before brands will actually start selling it, unfortunately. So in the early days, a lot of the brands that we associate with Lolita fashion today were originally selling Atome or Natural K clothing. Atome and Natural K are very similar, but Atome is much more structured and almost mod influenced, while as Natural K is strictly romantic style clothing. Natural K, I think, is what eventually evolved into Mori, but I couldn't tell you because Mori was really just very briefly a thing. But basically the Natural K aesthetic is just a bunch of gunny sack dresses and straw purses and whatever you would expect to wear waltzing through a meadow on a picnic with strawberries. Atome, on the other hand, means maiden. And I want that to stick in your head because back in the day, old GLBs actually used to still refer to the style as pure maiden style. A lot of the original classic Lolita looks were directly descendant from Atome style. This style remains pretty popular throughout the 80s. The way Harajuku fashion works is that it goes through cycles. A couple styles will stay really popular for a few years, and then eventually the style moves forward onto the next thing. But this subset did age out of Harajuku very quickly. Harajuku is largely a youth scene. It's right next to a college. It tends to try to appeal to younger audiences with the styles that are popular. So by the time the 90s rolls around, there's a whole new set of people that they're trying to appeal to. So in the 90s, we get Fruits. Also Kara, but mostly Fruits. Fruits starts production in 1997, and it is entirely comprised of street snaps of people from the Harajuku area. Sometimes also Shibuya because of Shibuya 109, but mostly Harajuku. The fashion of this era starts to evolve with Visual K influence as Visual K music starts to become really popular. So fashion sort of splits into two subsets, the super girly and the super edgy. I feel like the punky side eventually goes into decora and that sort of fashion, so I'm not gonna spend too much time discussing this since this is a Lolita focused history history, but I do want to do histories of other styles, so I'm sure we'll be circling back to that at some point. But the super feminine side of fashion evolves very interestingly at this point. Things start to become more and more structured, the quality of garments starts to go up. The younger generation holds on to that romantic era Victorian influence, but then it also starts to become a little bit more decadent, a little bit more over the top, a little bit more flamboyant, and then eventually they discover the bell petticoat and run with it. I don't think the actual term Lolita shows up until much later, probably the early 2000s. I don't think it's really something that they called it in the 90s. In my research, it seems like nobody can really agree where the term Lolita came from. Like, there's all these different theories, but nobody really has like one solid answer for why it's called that. Certainly in Japan, they know about the book. Like, there's this grand lie we like to tell ourselves that, oh, the novel just isn't as popular in Japan. It is. They know about it. They read it. It got translated like forever ago. They're fully aware of Lolita the book, and they're fully aware of the connotations of that. That's why lolicon is a thing over there. It was suggested in one of my favorite blogs a long time ago that perhaps the name Lolita didn't start within the fashion. And that kind of makes sense. When you think about it, like, punks didn't name themselves punks. Other people did as a derogatory term. And then eventually punks reclaimed it and now, like, proudly call themselves punks. Same with goth. Like, the original Batcave musicians were adamant that they were not goths and that they had nothing to do with that, even though, like, they were goth. I think the same thing sort of happened with Lolita. I think they saw the shape of the skirts, they saw the overall frilliness and the girlishness, and were like, are you trying to attract a certain kind of man with this style? And I'm sure Lolitas in the 90s probably didn't like being called that, or in the 80s, or whenever the name originated. And then I think by the time the early 2000s rolls around, by the time we start getting into the Kamikaze Girls era, I think at that point the name was just so ingrained with the community that they just kind of started embracing it. So let's talk about the early 2000s. In 2001, the Gothic and Lolita Bible starts publication as a spin-off of Kara. So we get our first Lolita fashion-centric magazine. It stopped production in 2018, but we're not gonna think about that. From here, we have a pretty clear line of evolution, as devoted fans and magazine publications keep track of brand releases and street snaps. Shops like Baby and AP start creating recognizable garments with silhouettes that match the new style of Lolita, and distinctly recognizable shapes become the norm. In 2004, Kamikaze Girls gets released in Japan, and later in 2006, we get the English translation in the US, and also the name Kamikaze Girls. The Lolita Handbook is also created on LiveJournal sometime during this era in 2004 to 2006, defining for once and for all the look in the West, at least, even though it never really intended to. It was always meant to be more of a guideline. And this is when Lolita really reaches its classic stage. If you remember my 3 stages of a trend video, you'll know that I talked about how each trend goes through 3 different stages. Prior to the 2000s, Lolita fashion was in that early stage of development. It didn't really look like anything, it didn't have a name, but it was still sort of a hint of a thing. Now in the 2000s, it's a thing. It is recognizable. You can point at it and say, that's Lolita. That is a thing that people are wearing. And for a long time, Lolita fashion reigned as king. I'd say for a good decade, it stuck around. But then around 2010, it did start to wane as many Lolitas started to embrace other styles or just aged out of that part of their life until we get to present day now in 2019. Lolita fashion definitely isn't as popular as it used to be, unfortunately, for better or for worse. Brands have closed, publications have stopped. It's not the Lolita heyday that it was in 2005 and onward, that's for sure. Current Harajuku styles tend to embrace a more K-pop and Western inspired look, a lot more modern, and almost like a 90s hip-hop style is really popular in Harajuku right now, but like the neon version. That edgier side of fashion that became Decora and kind of subsided a little bit while Lolita was super popular has kind of swung back, and now it's like fashion in Harajuku has done sort of a 180, and that it used to be really frilly and over the top, and now it's almost become a little bit more minimal. But those who still seek that girlier side of fashion have largely moved into styles like Larm. But overall, frumpier, less complicated styles like Pico Club have really pushed out that style that needs 2 layers of underwear. But Lolita is not dead any more than punk is dead. Just because it's not the 70s and 80s doesn't mean that there aren't people willingly going out and dressing like punks. And Lolita fashion is the same. There are still die-hard Lolitas out there that will refuse to let the style die. I know it's sad that it's not 2010 anymore and we don't have the GLBs anymore, but there is an ending to everything. Just like there is an ending to this video. That's it for today. I hope this was entertaining as well as informative, and let me know some other fashion styles you'd like a video like this about. I really want to do one for Pop K and Decora and Fairy K, although I think Pop K and Fairy K will wind up being the same video because they're kind of, their histories are just, they're like two sides of the same coin. Anyway, I will see you all next time. Bye!